You would open up your Bibles to Colossians chapter 3, and we'll begin there in just a moment. Colossians chapter 3. It's good to see each one here, and thankful for the time we have to worship together this morning. Appreciate the songs that Garrett just led for us. So much appreciate the efforts the song leaders make to find out what the sermons are and to lead songs that go along with the themes, and that is the case this morning. And appreciate all the thought that goes into the prayers that are led, the Lord's Supper talk this morning. It helps to have put that kind of effort in that you can see coming from the men who lead in worship. I want to conclude a series of lessons we've been looking at. If you're visiting with us, this is our fifth. And it'll be our final lesson in this series, though hopefully not the final lesson on the topic ever. I'm sure we'll find need to revisit from time to time. And certainly we've not said everything that could be said. The subject of masculinity is one that we've been giving some special attention to, and particularly in light of the culture that we live in. I think ways in which masculinity is attacked, ways in which masculinity is twisted. And what I want to do in conclusion this morning with all that we've talked about is talk about what are some of the major thoughts in our minds as we try to raise another generation of men. And I've titled the lesson, Building Men. In Colossians chapter 3 and in verse 23, it says, whatever you do, do your work heartily as for the Lord rather than for men, knowing that from the Lord you will receive the reward of the inheritance. Serve the Lord Christ. Here are two elements that I think need special, particular attention as we're raising boys to become men in our society today. These are not the only things that need focus, but I think they're areas that as we've looked through what it takes to be a man, ways that being a man has been twisted, that here are areas that need attention because our society has maybe robbed us of some of the attention that used to be given to these areas. The areas that we're going to talk about is hard work and identity. How to be good hard workers and who we are in our families and in Christ. And so I want to begin by talking about a theology of work. Now that word theology, don't run off with that word. All that means is thinking biblically about something, thinking the way God thinks about something. That's what we're talking about. We have more commonly in our vocabulary the idea of building a work ethic. But I want to go beyond the work ethic, because usually what that means is just you work hard. Working hard is valuable and needed, and that's part of what we're going to talk about. And that's part of the theology of work. It's part of thinking about work like God does. But it's not enough. And by itself, it actually produces one of those twisted forms of masculinity. That people who think hard work is the goal in and of itself, it's not. Hard work is meant to be a part of the way that we serve God. I want to begin, though, with this idea. We need to reclaim the goodness of work. The value of it, the goodness of it, talk about it in ways that speak to its pleasantness, of the blessing that it is and that it provides for us. I've said before, in Genesis chapter 2 and in verse 15, Genesis chapter 2 and in verse 15 there, before the first sin, before Adam and Eve are cast out of the garden, it tells us that Yahweh took the man and set him in the Garden of Eden to cultivate and to keep it, to work in the garden. Most people think that paradise demands an absence of work, that getting to a utopia is figuring out a way that we don't have to do work anymore. But at the very beginning, in perfection, in paradise, and the only utopia that's ever existed, there is work. There is, in fact, a garden to keep and cultivate. We need to talk about that like Ecclesiastes. Here, Ecclesiastes has so much negative to say about life under the sun, the miseries of the dead ends, of all the different ways that people try to find fulfillment. But all along are momentary bright spots where Solomon says, at least there's this. And in chapter 2 and verse 24 of Ecclesiastes, he says, there's nothing better for a man than to eat and drink and have his soul see good in his labor. This also I have seen, that it is from the hand of God. Now, he's actually not speaking about the labor, but the contentedness that comes from having done good labor, right? To be able to sit down and enjoy and know that what you're enjoying is the product of honest and good work. We don't sit down and just enjoy with contentment really many things in this world. But least of all, the value of the good hard work that we've done and that we've accomplished. But we need to. We need to think about it in the good that it produces and the value in the very simple, contented way here, or over in Ephesians chapter 4 and in verse 28, where Paul talks about the purpose of work, not just being a paycheck. Ephesians 4 and verse 28, he says, he who steals must steal no longer, but rather he must labor, performing with his own hands what is good, so that he will have something to share with the one who has need. It is easy to find ways to complain and to think of reasons to complain about the work that we do in our lives. Our kids hear that. They perceive that even if we don't say it out loud, the way that we try to avoid work. I hear people say from time to time about young men and just young people in particular that the effort that they put forth to get out of work is greater than the effort it would take to just do the work. Why do you think that is? Why do you think we've come to that place? I think because we talk in ways that say that we ought to look for ways to avoid work. I know that there's value in the statement, work smarter, not harder. I'm not for beating your head against a wall. I'm not for digging holes with soup spoons. But understand that sometimes if all we're ever saying is let's figure out a way to avoid the work, then that may end up in our children's minds in a very twisted way, where that's all that they can think of is let's avoid work. I've told you before, there are people all along through my life who have sent their sons to me, especially when I was in Montgomery and I was doing full-time construction work. They would send their sons to me and they would actually say, I want him to come work for you so that he will be motivated to go to school. And what? Now, they didn't usually say this, but not end up doing the kind of work you're doing. That's what they meant. I want my son to know that he certainly doesn't want a life filled with hard work. What a shame to have talked about work that way. And we've done it for a generation. And people now are bemoaning and say, we don't have any people in the service industry. Yeah, you told them that was menial, demeaning, dishonorable work. And then you're shocked when nobody wants to do it anymore. That's a shame. And we don't need to be contributing to that problem. We need to be talking about work as the honorable, good, satisfying thing that God gave us as a part of a happy life, as a part of a good life. In Philippians chapter 2 and verse 14, do all things without grumbling or disputing. Boy, I think about that. Obviously, there's a specific context in which Paul is writing those things. But as we expand that out, how easy is it for our children to look and say, yes, my dad still goes to work and he does the things, but it is a misery. And if I could avoid that, that would be better. It ought to be that what our children hear is that we talk about work the way God speaks about work, the way God sees work. And ultimately then, what we're trying to do is bring them along with us as we work, show them the value, the goodness, the purpose, and let them experience that all along. Not only do we often speak of work in ways that demotes its value in our minds and in our culture's minds, but we don't press our children into work. And so all along, not only are we speaking about it in this way of avoidance, but really they manage to avoid most of it until they become adults. And then all of a sudden we're like, hey, time to work. And we say, why don't kids want to work these days? Nobody's made them. Nobody's made the connections between here is how you build a life. The simple command in 1 Thessalonians chapter 4, the instruction, make it your ambition to lead a quiet life and attend to your own business and work with your hands just as we have commanded you, so that you will walk properly towards outsiders and not be in any need. Your ambition to lead a quiet life and attend to your business and work with your hands. Boy, that's just not a mantra for today, is it? Live your life in the public eye, become an influencer, get a YouTube channel, get followers. Well, it's just the very opposite, isn't it? Just go find a quiet, good job to do and do it for the rest of your life. And boy, that would be a real blessing. And so here's an opposite picture of what the world's presenting, and we have to fight against that. We have to swim upstream, push the stone uphill in order to get our sons, particularly, as that's what we're focusing on, to this point. Now, in order to create opportunities for daily work, we've talked about this. That used to not be, like, if you talk to a father like 200 years ago, how do you creatively come up with ways for your son to do things? What do you mean? We wake up. That's how we come up with ways for my son to do things. We just go to work. Now, so much of that work is just gone, right? A machine is doing that work. A factory's doing that work. And so many of the things that would have been normal parts of learning work and life and how all those things connect are gone. So now you do have to get creative, because even though those things have been taken out of the home, now I still want the result of those things. I still want the things that produced. Now here in older generation, like if one of the ways that we're doing that is we've planted a garden. Right? Incidentally, somebody said, well, I was teaching about this at PTC a couple weeks ago, and said, you just seemed obsessed with the garden. I said, I know. But the Bible, in fairness, does mention gardens an awful lot. So I think it's fair, that we give that some attention. And at the very least, what the garden produced. Now, sometimes an older generation, I've heard people talk about this. I've got friends that do some of the things that we're doing and more. They keep livestock. They've got chickens and they've got gardens and so forth. And the grandparents are saying, why are you doing that? We got away from that as quick as possible. And what I'd want to say to those grandparents is, don't you know what that produced? You're asking the questions of why kids are the way they are today. Maybe it's because we got away from all of that. It's not just maybe. I think it is because we got away from all of that. Because we expected less and less, and our thought process was, maybe in the worst cases, children shouldn't have to work like this. Why? They're going to have to. Why not bring them all along so that, we see that in school. We don't just dump everything all at once on them. We educate them little by little. But with work, it's like just one day. And I know we mock kids who go, now I have to adult. Guess what? It's because never in their life have they had to be an adult until all of a sudden they are. It should be all along. We're building that process. We're showing them what it means to build this kind of life that Paul says should be our ambition. I think about the example of Jesus, who comes to earth to live life as a man. And Philippians chapter 2 tells us to live as a servant. What did that look like? It looked like being the son of a carpenter. Our pictures of Jesus, and we talked about this, have been literally feminized through, I think, various motivations through through the decades. But we don't have that picture of Jesus as just a hard worker who would have had calluses on his hands, who knew what it was like to have to pick up heavy things and wield tools and all the difficulty that goes along with that. He was not some bookish boy who was tucked away until he became a scholar in his 30s. He was a man who lived that, shall we say, blue-collar lifestyle, a lower middle-class lifestyle of the trade of being a carpenter. In Lamentations chapter 3, Jeremiah, in the middle of the Lamentations, the climax there, you know, in verse 22, where it tells us loving kindness of Yahweh, the loving kindnesses of Yahweh indeed never cease. His compassions never fail. They are new every morning. Great is your faithfulness. Yahweh is my portion, says my soul. Therefore I wait for him. In verse 25, he continues, Yahweh is good to those who hope in him, to the soul who seeks him. It is good that he waits silently for the salvation of Yahweh. It is good for a man that he should bear the yoke in his youth. Have you had this conversation with your parents? You say, why do I have to do this? And there are some things where your parents will just say something like, it builds character. Listen, I know I didn't like to hear that any more than any other teenager in this room. But as I come to be an adult, I see how much truth there is in the need for things that even if they don't produce a thing that is necessary, like a garden, I can go get food without growing a garden. I can get it a lot easier. But yes, literally the reason we have that is to produce character. Somebody asked me recently about the chickens and said, you get eggs from that. And they say, well, how much does your feed cost? I told him, he said, that's not cheaper than getting them from the store. I said, I know. It's a lot more expensive than getting them from the store. But I'm not raising chickens. I'm raising kids. I want the thing that it produces. And I'm not talking about the eggs. So I go out of my way. I spend more money. I think we get caught up because we live in a world that is so focused on efficiency that we fail to recognize efficiency is not the only consideration, especially for us and especially in raising our children. And so people think about doing things around the house and the upkeep of the house. And they think, when I work an hour of work, I get paid so many dollars. And then, so if I do an hour of housework, that I could be doing this work over here that somebody's paying me for, then actually I can save money by just going to work and hiring somebody to do the housework. Or maybe my yard work. It's just really expensive to keep up equipment, to buy the equipment, to keep the equipment up and all of those things. And that's all costly. It's just more efficient and cheaper to hire somebody to come do it. Meanwhile, you got boys growing up, and girls too, who never learn to do those things. Who never learn to bear the yoke in their youth. Who never learn that it's a good thing and that you learn good things by bearing the yoke in your youth. And so put away the thoughts of efficiency and think in terms of it is a value. You're getting a thing that is worth far more than what you're paying for it by teaching your sons to work. It will be more inconvenient at the beginning. Right now, look, having a little helper with me usually means it's going to take twice as long is a way underestimate. We're probably not going to get the thing done. Right? It's just not going to happen. But I'm getting something else done. I'm getting the more important thing done, which is we're going to work. And he learns the value of work. We talk about Chicken Little all the time. He says, I don't want to pull weeds. I said, then I guess you don't want to eat. And he says, well, I do want to do that. Well, then you want to come pull weeds. We go through that. It's hot outside. Guess what? That's what the weeds like. We're going to pull weeds when it's hot. I'm tired. Guess what? The weeds don't stop growing because we're tired. We're going to work when we're tired. You learn these things. And then when they get up to be men, you don't have men who are lazy and irresponsible and set down their responsibilities as soon as life gets hard. And life has just gotten hard because it's the first time that they've ever been faced with it, because we protected them from it for these too many years. I'll say this one more thing about that. We're very wealthy. We have a lot of resources. And I hear men say from time to time, I can afford to pay somebody to do that. That's great. Pretty soon your son will leave the house and he can't. Now what? You didn't take the time because you had the resources to shed yourself of that work, which is fine. Look, when a man gets to the point where he does not have to paint his own walls, I hear you. I don't want to pick up the paintbrush either. But your son is going to start his own household, and he doesn't start at the same level of wealth that you are at, and now all of a sudden he knows nothing. Because I could afford to pay somebody to do that. Can you afford to pay somebody to do it for him? And for his household? And can you keep that wealth going like that? I see a lot of times guys who they couldn't afford it. They did it. They went through all that and they go, man, I'm done with that. You're not done. You got a son to teach. Maybe you got a grandson to teach. We want to continue to pass those things on. And all of this, though, what we want to be doing is connecting and pointing their attention towards God as the one for whom they work. God should saturate our conversations. It should be a constancy. And that certainly should be the case. We're not just teaching them that work has tangible rewards here and now, temporal rewards. But we want to teach them to be thinking always in the connectedness to the eternal. And so we come back to Colossians chapter 3. Whatever you do, do your work heartily as for the Lord rather than for men. And this should be both in small things and in great. When we are working and we are talking about matters of skillfulness, matters of workmanship, there's a lot of adages that we use to set aside the value of workmanship. We say something like, it's good enough for government work. And I'm sorry, I know there's a lot of government employees in the room, but you probably sympathize with me most. And so we just set that down. We get it to a good enough point and say, it's good enough. I know there's times where that's reasonable. But I think sometimes we can teach our kids all along the way that good workmanship doesn't really matter, especially if nobody's going to find out. Who will notice? Our response ought to be, God will. God is watching the whole thing. And our workmanship is not just for the customer. It's not for eyes to see. It is for God to see. And for Him to be pleased with the work that we do. This is also in small tasks that we, I think, make a small thing of. There's a meme that's been going around the internet for several years now. It's called the grocery cart theory. Maybe you've heard of this. And it is the idea that you can evaluate someone's morality by whether or not they return the grocery cart to the bin in the parking lot. And the reasoning is because it's a small thing. Everybody agrees that you ought to do it, but there's no legal repercussions if you don't. Nobody's standing there monitoring you, telling you you've got to return it unless you want to get that quarterback at Aldi. And so it's basically up to you to decide what to do about that. And what your decision says a lot. And frankly, I don't disagree. I think it's small moments like that. Like even in those moments, we're teaching our children. And if they're saying, why do we have to take it all the way back over there? Because we have a responsibility here as a culture that this is a small thing that they're asking us to do, and we can do that. And we can leave it because we wouldn't want the buggy left in our parking space or to scratch our vehicle. We're treating our neighbors as ourselves. You see, there's all sorts of theological implications. You're like, you're talking about returning a grocery cart. Yeah. All along, we're talking about why we do things and why they matter to God and not just to me and to you. So we want to make those connections. I think, too, a thing that we want to recover is finding examples and giving our sons opportunity to learn from those examples. This is the idea of apprenticeship. It's lost. There was a time when men begged other men and paid them to take their sons and teach them things. You know, today you come onto a job site and you expect to be paid the moment you start training. You expect to be paid to fill out the paperwork. Much less actually learning the things that you're supposed to learn to learn the trade. Used to, you recognize this is really valuable information. I need to pay you for this information. Only in one area, the colleges, which probably give you, on the whole, the most useless information, do they still ask you to pay them. Where they're actually giving you practical information, no, I want to get paid. And I want to get paid pretty handsomely. But I think in our sons' minds, we want to be pointing to skill and craftsmanship. Proverbs 22 and verse 29, the father does this, says, do you see a man skilled in his work? He will stand before kings, and he will not stand before obscure men. We want to notice it and say, that guy is a craftsman. And pay attention to it and point it out and show, and show them what that looks like, and maybe even show them the distinctions. I mean, one of the things that I've done, I'm kind of a jack of all trades, master of none, with particular emphasis on the master of none. And there have been times all along the way where I've told my children, when I say, look, this right here is craftsmanship. Do you see the difference between this and, for instance, what I've done? I don't know what I'm doing. This guy knows what he's doing. And here's how you can tell. Here's how you can see. I like to point those things out. But I want to go a step further. And within the community of the church, especially as we look around and say, here's a craftsman in our midst, I want to send my son over there. And I want to send him so that he's an aid and not a hindrance. But send him over there in a way that he's ready to consume the wisdom and value of being a good craftsman. I think these are mindsets, again, that would take some time to cultivate, to understand and appreciate the value of, reappreciate the value of. But those are sorts of things that I think we need to be pressing for as we're teaching our children to work. Not just that they will work, but that they think deeply about work. And that it becomes a part of who they are. That their lives are defined by work, with leisure and rest as the thing we do so that we can get back to work. And not the other way around. Not just, you got to take a break from your leisure so you can work long enough to get enough money to get back to your leisure. Which I'm afraid is kind of how life ends up being, especially from the time that we're born till we're about 18 at the very least. Well, let's talk about rooted identity then. Rooted identity. The idea of identity is one that I think I hope we understand is in a state of chaos in our current culture. And it goes along with the work and so forth. But specifically, I want to think about, who we're telling our children that they are. Society is saying let them find out who they are, but as Christians, our mindset ought to be instructing them about who they are. We need to be teaching our children that they are sons of the living God. In Genesis chapter 5 and verse 1, we have the beginning of the genealogy of Adam to Noah. It says there, this is the book of the generations of Adam. In the day when God created man, he made him in the likeness of God. He created them male and female. He blessed them and named them man in the day when they were created. And when Adam had lived 130 years, he became the father of a son in his own likeness, according to his image, and named him Seth. And so you see, in the first place, it goes back to the creation story. And it reestablishes where Adam comes from so that when it goes on from Adam, it can say, in the same way that Adam is created and created in the image of God, so is Seth. And so then are all those that follow, Enosh and so forth. All the way down to my son. You are created in the image of God. That is who you are. And your job, primarily above all else, is to bear that image well. To be faithful. Fear God and keep His commandments. This is the whole duty of man. That's who you are. We talked some time back about that word piety and how that involves devotion to family. And one writer said, piety doesn't say go figure out who you are. It says this is who you are. Now do your duty. And that starts with this is who you are in Christ. Galatians chapter 2 and verse 20 carries that on a little bit more specifically. I have been crucified with Christ, and it is no longer I who live, but Christ lives in me. And the life which I now live in the flesh, I live by faith in the Son of God, who loved me and gave Himself up for me. We need to be making constant appeals to the person of Christ, to the personality of Christ, the life that He lived. And we can do that in various ways. Obviously, we can do that by pointing to Scripture. We can do it like Paul says, imitate me as I imitate Christ. We can look for those imitators of Christ, and we can point our children in their direction. Now, I understand, I think it's wise when people say don't compare your children to each other. I wish you were more like your older brother or your younger brother, whatever. I get that can be divisive in so many ways. But I think it's very valuable to compare ourselves to people who are following Christ in very challenging ways. And so, when my daughters have come to me and said, what am I supposed to do in this situation? I say, well, and then I bring somebody up that I know will be challenging. What do you think Tom Holly would say right there? Don't bring him up. Why do they want that? Because they know that it's going to be a demand of a higher calling, a demand of a higher responsibility than what they want to. They'd rather me bring up, what would your friend say? Exactly what I said. No, that's not enough. Our lives should be a constant state of looking upwards and seeing how we can reach upwards. And it should be a constant conversation. Deuteronomy chapter 6 talks about that. Beginning in verse 1 talks about when you rise up and when you lie down and when you walk by the wayside, that this is the ever-present conversation of our households. This week, Ron and I, we were by ourselves all week. And so we had a lot of one-on-one conversations. And along the way, I was just asking him, what's the most important thing for you to do? And at the time, we were working, and so he said, to work. I said, that is a very important thing. For who? He said, well, for you. Again, that's pretty important. But ultimately, obviously, I was trying to get him to the answer, and we got there eventually. For God. That's who we're working for. I want, when your kids are little, I think we do that sometimes. Who made the sun? God made the sun. Who made everything? God made everything, right? But somewhere along the way, those conversations just kind of fall off. And they're not as regular a part of our... At the point, I think, when children are beginning to most need that understanding and that sort of constant thought process of God and their connectivity to Him and to His Son is maybe when we start disconnecting and we stop having those needed conversations. So, you're a son of God. That means things. You're created by God. That means things. You're created as a man in God's image. That means things. That requires certain specific responsibilities. And it's not the same as being created as a woman in God's image. That requires different responsibilities. Yeah, they overlap, but they are distinct. And so we need to be communicating those things to our children. We also need to teach our children that they are rooted in the identity of our family. Here is where I think it starts to get challenging. I think the first one we know sometimes we just don't live up to that responsibility. In the second case, I think here is something that we're almost afraid of. We're almost afraid to put the burdens of responsibility of family onto our children, to keep them connected to family. We're afraid of pressuring them, putting them on guilt trips and things of that nature. And so we want to let them be their own person, we say. I want my kids to be their own person, but I want them to recognize that that person carries my last name. And so you don't get to be your own person separate and distinct from everybody else in this house. You have a place in this house. You were born into this house, and that comes with responsibilities. And we live in a world where we think responsibilities aren't mine unless I agreed to them. Let me tell you what, that's not the world you were born into. You're born into a world where, by virtue of being born, you have responsibilities to people simply because you are biologically related to them. Well, I didn't choose them. God did. And His choices are more important than yours. He said those are your parents. Those are your brothers and sisters. Those are your grandparents. And you have roles and responsibilities. And Paul says in Ephesians chapter 6, and beginning in verse 1, it's our job to teach them what that looks like. Ephesians chapter 6, beginning in verse 1, children, obey your parents in the Lord, for this is right. Honor your father and mother. How are they going to know what that means? But that I teach them, which is the first commandment with a promise, so that it may be well with you and that you may live long in the land. I need to teach them what that means. Fathers, do not provoke your children to anger, but bring them up in the discipline and instruction of the Lord. Here is your place. Here is your role. Here are your responsibilities. And that is certainly part of being in that home, and it includes what their roles will be as they mature and grow into those. But I want to add another element to that, is that we need to teach them that they are specifically rooted to this family that they are a part of. That my children are a part of the Russell household. And what does that mean? In Exodus chapter 3 and in verse 6. Exodus chapter 3 and in verse 6, God says to Moses, He introduces Himself. He said also, I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob. And then Moses hid his face and he was afraid to look at God. If somebody came to you and they introduced themselves as the God of your great-great-great-great-great-great-great-grandfather, or just somebody who was acquainted with your great-great-great-great-great-grandfather, that's not as many greats as are here, but you get the idea. I would not even know who they were talking about. Like if they said, I am the God of, and then said, that guy's name. Okay, you're going to have to give me some context. But there was a connectedness here that God could come and say, here is who I am. It is connected to your ancestors. And it was such that Moses could know and appreciate and understand the weight of that claim. You see that in Jeremiah chapter 35. Obviously, in this case, you might say, yes, but that's like the father of the whole nation. Yeah, in Jeremiah chapter 35, it's the Rechabites, and it doesn't even go back to Rechab, who is the ancestor that they're named after. It goes back to one of the Rechabites back in the days of Jehu, who said to his family of Rechabites, here's what we're going to do to detach ourselves from all of this immorality that's going on. We're going to live in tents. We're not going to have vineyards, etc. And he says, look at how loyal they've remained to the house. Now, I know maybe some of our thoughts as we hear that are, yeah, but we need to be more loyal to God than we do the household. True. But we need to be loyal to the house because we're loyal to God. In the ways that God commands us to be loyal to the house. I appreciate the phrase, God has no grandchildren. You've heard that? God has no grandchildren. You've heard that. That's right. But we do. We've got grandchildren. And guess what I want for my grandchildren, who aren't even born yet? I want my grandchildren to be affected positively by the things that I say and do now. I want the things that I am doing and the work that I am doing to ripple on down through the generations, and maybe not as drastically or rather as definably as Jehonadab and the Rechabites, but in some ways I want my grandchildren to be able to say we are Christians partly because of the work of our grandfather. I was talking to Caleb Westbrook when he was here. We were talking about, a number of things. His dad left, said he'd come back and pick him up later. He came back. We're still talking about a number of things. But one of the things we were talking about was this idea right here, how disconnected we are from the generations. And he said that one of the things that they're trying to do is incorporate and figure out ways to reconnect their children. So the Catholics have a holiday called All Saints Day, and that's the day before Halloween. And so he said, we're using that, and we're calling it Cloud of Witnesses Day. And what we're doing is we're pulling out pictures and names of people in our family's history that have helped us get to where we are now, spiritually in particular. And so we were talking about Leonard's dad, Leonard. That's one of the pictures they're going to pull out this October and say, here are the things I remember him teaching me and that I want you to remember. And I realized I named my son Ryland Edward. He got to meet Edward Brackwell. That's about it. He won't have lasting memories, the good memories that I have. He won't have those unless I give them to him. I want him to think one day, I'm named Edward because here's the impact this man had on our family. I realize my girls barely remember my dad's dad. They don't have the memories of him that I do. And they don't know how he shaped me and my thinking. And frankly, I would go outside the family to my spiritual family, and I'm going to pull in pictures of Brother Waldron and say, let me tell you about this man. And they won't be able to hear his words ringing in their ears like I can. Like I can remember him saying it like it was yesterday. But even if they can't hear his voice, I hope they hear my voice and think, I hope 2 generations from now, people are talking about the folks that made my family what it is. Because we reconnected them to that. It says, this is why we are who we are. We've lost that. People used to tell those stories all the time. People used to tell the stories of how they came to be in this place and how they came to believe the things that they believed. I want what Paul says about Timothy, that his faith was the faith that dwelt in his mother and in his grandmother. I want to be able to say that generationally about my sons and my grandsons and granddaughters. We need to then root them in the identity of the church, not just in our family, but in the extended family that is the church. In Mark chapter 10 and verse 30. Mark chapter 10 and verse 30. Jesus says, beginning of verse 29, I say to you, there is no one who has left house or brothers or sisters or mother or father or children or farms, there's your garden, for my sake and for the gospel's sake, except one who will receive 100 times as much now in the present age. Houses and brothers and sisters and mothers, children and farms, along with persecutions in the age to come, eternal life. God made promises about the church, about what it would mean and what it would provide. And for various cultural reasons, we're not as close as I think churches have been. There were pressures that made them close. We'll talk about some of that in another lesson. But we want our children to see this as the extended family. And in fact, in some ways, we want them to see this as the family that they need to maintain fellowship with, even if they were to lose fellowship with their physical family. That ultimately, this is where their mothers and fathers and sisters and brothers are coming from. I'm not just talking about play dates, though I think those are good. I'm not just talking about potlucks, though I think those are good. I'm talking about real connectivity. Teaching our children to see this family in a way that helps them learn to develop compassion and respect and patience, the hard work of loving one another. But we fill their lives up with so many competing communities. We fill their lives up with other families, and we say, here's your baseball family, here's your school family, and eventually here's your work family, and this is just another one in a long list of communities that you're part of. It's not. It's the community from which every other aspect of our life should flow. And then in all of this, we need to understand that we are swimming upstream, that there are great cultural challenges. In Proverbs chapter 22, Proverbs 22 and in verse 6. Some of your translations will say, train up a child in the way he should go, and when he is old, he will not depart from it. The LSB here, I think, has taken a page from some modern scholarship. It says, train up a child according to his way, and when he is old, he will not depart from it. This translation is unfortunately, I think, in keeping with what you read from a lot of books today, which is you need to figure out what the way of your child is and then teach him how to follow that path. Figure out what their path is, train them to tread that path, and then they'll be able to stay on that path. And so they would emphasize in the old translation, train up a child in the way he should go, train up a child in the way he should go. As if that's going to be completely unique and distinct. And you go, well, aren't there uniquenesses? Yes. But I think the uniquenesses get way too much play. And the sameness doesn't get enough play. And I think that there are ways that he should go that apply across the board. There are ways that we ought to be men that are universal. I think it's really a modernist folly to highlight the need for us to exaggerate the individual personalities and talents. There's room for individual personality. There's room for individual talents. But we've made it all about those things instead of using those things to conform to the identity of God and family and church. It is not that you should have this identity that makes you distinct from God. You should figure out how to use that identity, and wherever that identity conflicts, guess what? Cut it off. You say, well, that's just who I am. Not anymore. Better not be. I just like to express myself this way. Learn to express yourself a different way. What we've done is we've told children to go find themselves. My uncle likes to point out that the brain, my Uncle Jonathan, he says this to teenagers all the time. He says, your brain is not fully developed until you're 25 years old. And so when your parents say you are brain damaged, they're not so far off because your brain is actually still developing. At a point when children are developing, they don't have full moral awareness and understanding, and they are gathering information, and we're saying at that moment, you got hormones raging, changes happening all along, go figure it out. What folly. The opposite is true of the book of Proverbs. The book of Proverbs is, let me tell you who you are. And when we get to chapter 31 and we have this mother who is speaking to her son who is the king. Let me tell you what kings do. And let me tell you what kings don't do. Let me tell you the kind of women that a king looks for. And the rest of the book would tell you would give you examples of what kind of woman a king does not look for. And we just get hands off. Look, they just got to be who they are. I don't want them to be who they are. I don't want them to just guide their own path. I want to show them, here is the path. Here is the path to goodness, to being a good man. And I want to help define that for them. And some of that's going to include giving details. You know, we tell our sons, go be whatever you want to be. Just so long as you can be at church on Sundays. That is not the only concern. There are so many things out there that they could be that would help them in their fulfillment of the way that they should go. And there's so many ways that things that they do could get in the way of that. So when my daughter came to me a few years ago and said, here's the career path I'm thinking about. And I said, Emma, as I understand it, you want to be this kind of woman. How is that going to help you accomplish that? Here are the ways that would get in the way of that. I want you, whatever you do when you go to college, I want you to make sure that you're thinking, I'm going to go do something. I'm going to go learn something that will not only not detract from the thing that I want to live, the responsibility that I want to live out, but will actually be an asset and an aid to that. I think our boys need to be thinking that way. What's going to help me be the man God wants me to be? Not just fulfill my desires. You know, I want to go find a career that's fulfilling to me. Is it going to fulfill your responsibilities? Are you going to be the father you want to be and do that? Is it going to help you, in fact, do that? Or is it going to compete with that? All of these things are about defining an identity that I think we, even in our own minds, leave somewhat undefined. But by grounding their identity in Christ and family and church, I think we help our boys navigate the pressures of the modern culture to develop that strong, God-centered sense of self instead of leaving their identity up for grabs and giving them only the barest foundations and expecting them to just figure out the rest. Culture has shifted radically on the ideas of work and the ideas of identity. And it seems poised to shift even further. And so we need to do better than simply cut out the explicit sinful elements, but otherwise look pretty well the same as the world. We need a better vision for our sons. One that is rooted in God's Word and has as its ultimate goal the picture of the man, Jesus Christ. Maybe we don't get to everywhere we want to be with that in our own lifetimes. I think one of the things is I wish I could go further back than just my grandparents, but I don't know. I don't know much past that. I hope to establish those things generationally. But we need to start those things now if we hope to develop a better culture in our own homes. I also understand that as I mention these things, talk about finding ways for your children to work, going and implementing ways for your children to work. You may not think my ideas are the best. I am open for ideas. I hope you are. I hope you're open to the notion that you need the thing even if it's very inconvenient. We're swimming upstream against a greater tide than ever in our lifetimes. So we need to acknowledge that and prepare for the work. Maybe you're here and you realize with yourself that you don't have a theology of work, or more importantly, that your identity is not rooted in Christ the way it ought to be. If you're not a Christian, then it's certainly not there. But maybe you're a Christian and that is simply one compartment of your life. It is not enough. It must be me crucified, Christ lives in me. If there's any way that we can help you to root yourself in that identity this morning, whether it's obeying the gospel call or repenting and reestablishing that call in your life. If we can help you, won't you come forward while we stand and while we sing?